But Charles and Ezra, listen, we are getting into Labyrinth, the true story of the city of lies, the murders of Tupac and Notorious Big. This is good, man. And the implication of the Los Angeles Police Department. So we're going to go ahead and get into it, guys. I'm coming at my reaction. Hit that thumbs up button.
Said, Death Row ran a money laundering operation that took in as much as $80,000 per month. Suge was a classic bully, but he was shrewd and nervy at the same time, Hackey said, with a real talent for psychologically manipulating the people around him. The cops still underestimated him. He was as powerful as any gangster in the country. Hackey used almost the same words that Frank Alexander had in describing Suge Knight's approach to business. Both bodyguards said that Knight only let people get close if he had something on them, Poole recalled, and that he always lets it be known that you will be killed if you cross him. Suge met with Omar Bradley and Mustafa Farrakhan to talk about backing Bradley's run for a vacant congressional seat, Hackey said, yet at the same time treated the Compton mayor like one of his bun boys. And after Knight caught Bradley messing around with one of his girlfriends, Hackey added, Suge told the mayor that if he ever came near the young woman again, he was a dead man. David Kenner was the brains of the company, Hackey said, and it was common knowledge at Death Row that the attorney provided connections to the organized crime families back east. Although he was absolutely certain that Suge and Reggie Wright had been behind Biggie Smalls' murder, Hackey said, he had no real evidence that Suge was responsible for Tupac's slaying. He believed it was more than possible that Suge had been involved, though, Hackey added. Shakur and Knight were fighting over money all summer. When Tupac would ask for the royalties he was owed, Suge would respond by sending him a $40,000 or $50,000 bill for the expenses his family had run up at the Westwood Marquee. Everyone at Death Row recognized that Tupac was inching his way toward the door, and when he fired David Kenner, they knew the rapper was risking his life. In fact, Wright had turned on Hackey because Reggie and Suge believed the bodyguard was encouraging Tupac to leave L.A. and relocate to Atlanta. Tupac definitely did not want to go to Las Vegas on the weekend he was murdered, Hackey said, and changed his mind only because Suge went to work on him. He was unimpressed by the fact that Suge was in the car with Tupac when the rapper was shot, Hackey said. Suge was bold enough to take that chance. Frank Alexander wasn't the only one whose life was threatened after Tupac died, Hackey told Poole. Reggie Wright had phoned him to say, I can have you killed at any time. He believed, by the way, that Reggie had been behind the murder of Orlando Anderson, Hackey said. Wright owned a champagne-colored Chevy Blazer that matched the description of a suspect vehicle described in witness reports in that killing. And no matter what else they heard, Hackey told Poole and Miller, Reggie Wright was the one running Death Row while Suge was in prison. Reggie was Suge's little bitch and did his master's bidding without question. Kevin Lewis had no evidence that Suge was involved in the murders of either Tupac Shakur or Biggie Smalls, but the former Death Row studio manager had no doubt that Knight was capable of killing anyone he wished to eliminate. The terror in his eyes was what made Lewis so persuasive. It had taken Poole months to arrange a sit-down with Kenneth Knox's main informant, who vowed that he would never set foot in Los Angeles again. A scheduled meeting in Chicago was aborted when Lewis phoned from New York to say he couldn't make it, and that he still feared Suge Knight might have him killed. And when Death Row's former manager finally rendezvoused with Poole in Chicago, he added little that he hadn't already told Kenneth Knox. Lewis did acknowledge for the first time that he had been present when Kelly Jamerson was beaten to death at the El Rey Theater, though, and said he, in fact, stepped over the body on his way to the nearest exit. Getting away with that murder, Lewis said, definitely emboldened Suge and his thugs. Lewis also spoke in greater detail than previously about the fights between the Crips and the Bloods that had broken out in the Tarzana studios, and told Poole that Suge had seemed to encourage these near riots. Those battles had created a real dilemma for Snoop Dogg, who was more blue than red, Lewis said, and might be the one important Death Row rapper willing to talk about what he knew. 8 months earlier, the Long Beach detective who infiltrated Death Row as part of the federal task force had told LAPD detectives that Suge used to slap Snoop Dogg around like a little girl. He believed Snoop hated Suge enough to betray him, the Long Beach detective said. What Poole didn't know when he spoke to Kevin Lewis was that Snoop already had hit back at Knight. On May Day, shortly after breaking with Death Row to join Master P at No Limit Records, Snoop had appeared on stage to perform one song with his new partner at a concert in the Universal Amphitheater. As soon as Snoop stepped away from the microphone, he was surrounded by 5 Bloods. When one of them punched him in the face, the rapper broke free and ran toward the metal detector behind the stage, where a pair of deputies from the nearby LA County Sheriff's substation were posted. After the deputies called for backup, it took another 20 deputies, along with 4 dozen security guards, to break up the mob of young black males that had grown to more than 60. Once they got Snoop inside the substation, deputies did a pat-down search and found a baggie filled with marijuana in the rapper's hip pocket. The lieutenant who commanded the substation then interviewed Snoop personally and eventually relayed his account to Poole. "I think I know who killed Tupac," the lieutenant said. "I do too," Snoop replied, "the guy who was seated next to him." "You mean Suge Knight?" the lieutenant asked. "Yes," Snoop answered. The rapper's explanation was essentially the same one given by Frank Alexander and Kevin Hackey. Suge owed Tupac $3 million and didn't want to pay it, especially if Shakur was going to leave his label. Armed with what he had learned from Alexander, Hackey, and Lewis, Poole once again approached his superiors in the Robbery-Homicide Division, seeking permission one more time for a full-scale investigation of the clues that implicated David Mack in the Biggie Smalls murder. Again, he was rebuffed. "The only explanation I got was, those clues aren't viable," Poole recalled. When I asked why they weren't viable and if there had been an investigation that exonerated Mack, I was told it was none of my business. That was a first. Here I am still listed as the lead investigator on the Biggie Smalls case, and the investigation of the person I consider the main suspect is none of my business. Poole was beginning to believe that the explanation for this was very simple. Criminal cops get protected because the department wants to avoid scandal and publicity. And in the Los Angeles of the post-Rodney King years, that protection seemed to increase exponentially whenever the criminal cops were black. The LAPD's new double standard was nowhere so obvious as in the different treatment received by Kevin Gaines and Frank Liga. While Gaines not only escaped repeatedly from the consequences of his actions and was sheltered from investigation even after his death, Liga remained under a cloud long after the evidence submitted by Poole had demonstrated his innocence. Chief Parks ordered internal affairs investigators to comb through Liga's personnel package, breaking down every use of force by Liga during his 10 years on the force into assorted categories, including the suspect's race. IA investigators twice ran tests at the Gaines-Liga shooting scene to verify that it was a dead spot where Liga's radio broadcasts couldn't be picked up at LAPD headquarters. Even after the LAPD's officer-involved shooting unit and a 3-man shooting board agreed that Liga's actions had been within departmental policy, Parks authorized a costly, computer-generated 3D video model of the shooting, then nullified the ruling of the first shooting board, and convened a second, this one made up entirely of black officers. That board also cleared Liga. I gave them my final follow-up report months before they finally approved it and exonerated Liga, Poole recalled. It was in delay mode for a long time, the longest I'd seen in my entire career. The whole thing was blatantly political, and I was shocked when I saw the internal affairs report on Gaines later that year. They kept a lot of things out, including that 15-7 report from Officer Guidry that Gaines was a possible dope courier for Suge Knight. Frank Liga's ordeal wasn't over either. When the detective's personnel package had been sent to the city attorney's office to prepare for the lawsuit filed by Johnny Cochran, the documents inside disappeared for 18 months. During that time, Los Angeles newspapers ran a series of stories detailing every complaint filed against Liga during his career. There were 4, and although not one of them was sustained, articles filled with verbs like punched, kicked, and tackled created a troubling impression, especially when coupled with Cochran's charge that Liga was a racist, out-of-control cop. Only when the LAPD's final report was presented in March of 1998 did the public learn that the first of these complaints, made by an arrestee who claimed Liga bound his wrists too tightly with handcuffs, was filed 8 months after the incident. The second complaint had been made by an arrestee who said Liga had kicked him in the kidneys, but omitted that Liga had just found a concealed pistol in the suspect's boot and had forced the man back to the ground only after he tried to stand up. The third complaint, filed by an arrestee whose nose had been broken when Liga and his partner tackled him, was dropped when the man pleaded guilty to resisting arrest. The fourth complaint, filed by an arrestee who claimed Liga had beaten him, was dismissed after the man's friend said he had made up the story, and investigators learned that Liga hadn't even been on the scene at the time the incident occurred. An embittered Liga demanded to know why the newspapers didn't want to put that information on their front pages. Liga, like Russell Poole, was furious when he learned that Kevin Gaines's friend, Derwin Henderson, had gotten off with a slap on the wrist. Henderson should have at least been fired and could easily have been charged with interfering with an investigation, Poole said. Instead, he gets a 5-day suspension for inappropriate conduct. If the races were reversed in this case, and a bunch of white officers had gone out to question witnesses like he and his friends did, all hell would have broken loose. Heads would have rolled. Whatever role race played in it, Poole remained convinced that the LAPD brass was intentionally covering up for the officers who had been involved with death row records. Each time I pushed to go down that road in the Biggie Smalls investigation, Poole recalled, the brass told me, we're not going to get involved in that. Their attitude was, Gaines is dead, Mac has already gone down for bank robbery, let's not get involved in more controversy. Poole believed more controversy was inevitable, however. Each time he reviewed his notes of the interview with Kevin Hackey, Poole would pause at the answer Hackey had given when asked to identify any members of the Los Angeles Police Department who were close to Suge Knight. All he knew, Hackey said, was that 3 LAPD officers had shown up regularly at the private parties Suge Knight threw for his inner circle. Kevin Gaines was the only one whose name he knew, Hackey said. The second man the bodyguard would identify a few months later as David Mack. Hackey did not identify the third officer until more than 2 years later when he was shown a photograph of Ray Perez.
Wow, man. This stuff gets deeper. It gets deeper, y'all. We're going to be back with a little bit more of the labyrinth by Randall Sullivan a little bit later on, couple days, couple weeks. I'll probably do another one. But if you want to listen to it right now, you ain't got to wait for me. You can just go ahead and go to Audible and check it out. It's called Labyrinth by Randall Sullivan. This is some real deep stuff in it, and they're really going heavy about these Coach Tupac and Biggie murders. Other corruption, not just that, but corruption with like LAPD and Las Vegas PD and even the NYPD PD, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, y'all, go ahead and leave your comments, subscribe to Charles and Appreciate it.